With premier talent coming back from injury and others developing as they get more and more reps, we've got a lot to cover today. Here are your Week 5 running back rankings. As always, if you guys are enjoying the content, feel free to like and subscribe, and if you have any suggestions for new content, comment those as well. We'll start with Christian McCaffrey because when somebody scores 48.7 points, has 4 touchdowns, and is still hovering around 6 yards per carry for the season, I hardly care about anything else. The offensive line is firing on all cylinders in San Fran. CMC is traveling 2.6 yards before the first point of contact, which is phenomenal. Yes, Dallas, his matchup this week, has some impressive names on defense without a doubt, but their run defense specifically, it could be better. They're allowing 4.6 yards per carry, but they're stingy around the end zone as they've only given up 2 scores on the ground in 4 weeks. Even so, I will gladly take somebody who is averaging right at 150 all-purpose yards per game. He's on an insane pace, CMC is, to clear 2,500 by the end of the season. Bijan Robinson comes in at number 2 and still holds a slim lead as the receptions leader among all running backs with 19 of them. In Week 4, he was the 3rd most targeted receiver for Atlanta. Tyler Algier is not posing much of a threat to Robinson's usage anymore, considering that Robinson is averaging 18 touches per game through 4 weeks and is averaging right at 6 yards per carry, super efficient as well. Arthur Smith already didn't seem too eager to give the keys of this offense to Desmond Ridder, considering that Atlanta is a run-heavy squad as it is, and I would double down on that assumption that this will be a team leaning on its running backs going forward. Tony Pollard has a tough matchup, but you'll see in explanations about the players behind him that I can't move Pollard any lower here. If it wasn't for the 3rd Cowboys blowout of the year, Pollard would have had more than 14 touches. Dallas handled New England, and it was essentially all Deuce Vaughn by the time the 4th quarter hit. Still got another 4 yards per carry performance out of Tony Pollard, and while the matchup against San Francisco's front 7 will be anything but easy, we can expect that the starters on both sides will be staying in for this heavyweight matchup. Putting Josh Jacobs all the way up here may seem generous considering he's had just 1 productive fantasy week in 4 tries, but consider these 2 things for me. For one, if we see more of Aiden O'Connell, he just went check down galore and made Josh Jacobs the leading receiver in yards ahead of Devontae Adams last week. Jacobs had 11 targets on the day, which was just behind Adams at 13. The other factor to consider is that even though Jacobs is behind a horrible offensive line, teams have seen success running against Green Bay, his matchup this week. The Packers allow the 9th most amount of fantasy points to running backs. Travis Etienne didn't have the best week despite seeing plenty of volume in Week 4. He took 20 rushes for just 55 yards, anything but optimal, but he did see at least 3 targets for the 4th week in a row. Etienne is still one of the toughest rushers in the league, only trailing David Montgomery. In broken tackles this year, Etienne has 10 of them. He has 14 of the running back room's 17 receptions so far, so it is all Travis Etienne in the running and passing game. It is going to be stiff competition against Buffalo as the Bills are 5.5-point favorites, but they're allowing a ridiculous 6.3 yards per carry so far. That's the highest mark in the league. Derrick Henry is one of my sell high options for this week. Make sure to check out the video we posted before this to see the other 7 options I have. You cannot deny that Derrick Henry looked much more like himself last week. Efficiency was up. Vrabel had him doing jump passes again. And the most important part, the Titans were winning. Henry is still averaging below 4 yards per carry on the season, so temper your expectations here, but this should be a wide open contest with the Colts being just 1-point favorites at home. Essentially, it's an even split. Treylon Burks is currently questionable at the time of this recording, so we'll see if the wide receiver 2 ends up being absent, and Indianapolis has allowed 6 rushing touchdowns through 4 games. I'd say there's a decent chance the big fella punches in at least 1. Alvin Kamara saw all of the usage in the world in his game back. Some Saints fans might even argue that Derek Carr liked him a little too much, because he kept throwing checkdowns in a game where the Saints got dominated. Carr targeted Kamara 7 more times than anybody else in a game where the Saints lost by 3 possessions. I guess you can argue that's the benefit of having somebody with this much receiving upside. He didn't do much, all things considered. 13 receptions for 33 yards. Might just be one of the weirdest stat lines I've ever seen. He faces the Patriots this week with New England being 1.5-point favorites at home. If this one is closer, maybe we get more usage on the ground and an opportunity to get into the end zone with the Saints having a week under their belt with all of their pieces in place for once. I'm slowly but surely hopping on the Kyren Williams train because my one complaint about him through the first couple of weeks is progressing. His efficiency. We always talk about the 3 components of availability, opportunity, and productivity. Williams is healthy, mostly. I did just see he has a hip bruise, but there isn't much worry surrounding it. Opportunity-wise, I would say over 18 touches per game so far is optimal for sure. Well, productivity is now there. He went from 3.5 to 3.7 to 3.8 and now 4.1 yards per carry in his 4th game. And he was in for over 70% of snaps once again. Kyren Williams is a touchdown machine. He has 6 so far. And win, lose, or tie against the Philadelphia Eagles, the Rams have made it clear that Williams will be heavily involved in their offensive scheme. On the other sideline and right behind him in my rankings is DeAndre Swift. Swift is in one of the best rushing offenses in the entire league in Philly, and yes, he has the volume competition specifically with a rushing quarterback, but it's been his backfield over the course of the last 3 weeks. He has 59 rushes on the season and is averaging a beautiful 4.2 yards before contact behind that protective front line. Game script wise, it helps to be one of 2 remaining undefeated teams. The Eagles take on the Rams this week and are 4.5-point favorites on the road as Swift looks to clear 14 fantasy points for the 4th week in a row. Saquon Barkley against Miami. This pick is strictly based on the possibility of Barkley being 100%. If there is a snap count of any kind, drop him down at least a tier. The Giants need Saquon. We'll start with that. They've lost 8 of their last 11 games without him. Daniel Jones has more interceptions than touchdowns in those games, and this team legitimately looks like one of the worst in the league when Barkley is not on the field. He doesn't have a great matchup against Miami, a team projected to win via a blowout, but Saquon should be in line for usage if the Giants at least want to stay competitive. He had 27 fantasy points on 26 touches in week 2. We'll see what kind of usage he gets here. I will continue to harp on the fact that Joe Mixon is going to be a prominent figure in this Bengals backfield. He had a season-low 15 touches against Tennessee due to the fact that they blew out Cincy, but Mixon ran for an efficient 4.8 yards per carry, still doing his job well. The Cardinals allow 4.4 yards per carry. That's his matchup this week. And since he is a 3-point favorite on the road, look, Burrow is still bruised up and the Bengals are predicted to get ahead. No T. Higgins either. The quality of this offense is dropping, but Mixon's chances to be a major part in it are rising. If you would have told me that I'd be putting David Montgomery in the top 12 of my rankings at any point this year, I probably would have called you bonkers, but here we are. Dan Campbell and this Lions team are once again relying on a workhorse back. Last year it was Jamal Williams, and this year it's Montgomery. Then they supplement the younger, quicker running back out in the open field with a greater receiving involvement. Last year it was DeAndre Swift. This year it's Jahmyr Gibbs. I'm usually not a fan of these backs who are brought in to do the dirty work without much pass catching involvement, but I can't deny 30 touches in a game and now 5 touchdowns through 3 games for Monty. Not to mention he has broken a league-leading 12 tackles as a member of this Lions backfield. Trust him against a Carolina team allowing over 135 rushing yards per contest. James Cook gave us another consistent performance last week that we cannot be mad about. It got a little dicey considering his efficiency was down to 2.4 yards per carry in this team's contest against the Dolphins, but his first touchdown of the season came at literally the perfect time. We also saw Latavius Murray and Damian Harris dig into Cook's touches with 4 and 6. And both were more efficient than him, so we got to keep an eye on this. Even so, the guy was involved in all fronts and gave us a double-digit fantasy performance once again, despite being in for half the snaps. Start him, but monitor him closely against Jacksonville this week. Devon Achane may be the most compelling player in fantasy football right now. He has more touches than Raheem Mostert in the last 2 weeks now, indicating that we are likely seeing a changing of the guard at the RB1 spot in Miami as more and more reports come out. And his stats right now are just insane, like absolutely absurd. Over 11 yards per carry in the last 2 games combined, 7.3 yards before contact per attempt. He is not being touched until he travels 7 yards on average. That is baffling. He already leads the league with 12 rushes for at least 20 yards out of the 27 attempts that he's had. Some of these numbers are obviously inflated on a small sample size, but some NFL players will go their entire career without having that average in 1 game. Achane has it over the course of 2. Achane is the RB4 in standard PPR after 2 phenomenal games. Let's see what he does against the Giants in a game where Miami is favored by 11 points. Isaiah Pacheco rolls in next in a pretty optimal spot for week 5. He has 3 straight weeks with at least 4 yards per carry and 2 straight weeks with a trip to the end zone. Minnesota, his matchup this week, does only allow 3.5 yards per carry, but the Chiefs are projected to win this game on paper by 5 points. If Pacheco gets involved in the receiving game against this horrible secondary, or just gets touches in the latter stages of the game with the Chiefs up, we are in fine shape. James Conner fell victim to a game script that just didn't allow Arizona to run the ball, considering they're playing catch-up with San Francisco all evening long. He still looked great. Conner is a tough runner who is second in the league in total yards after contact. Now he faces off against a Cincinnati team that is only favored by 3 points, and Joe Burrow has looked bruised up and horrible. Conner should have an opportunity for some more volume, and the Bengals allowing 5.1 yards per carry certainly helps his case. Aaron Jones was back last week, but he wasn't really back. Green Bay used him a lot less than we anticipated. Jones was only in for 35% of snaps, and the Lions factoring the Packers out of the game early didn't help his case at all. He had just 6 touches and wasn't efficient when he got the ball. Lucky for him, he's facing a Raiders team this week that allows the 4th most amount of fantasy points to the position. I also don't see Green Bay losing this game. Maybe this comes back to bite me on tape, but Las Vegas looks horrible so far. Green Bay having a lead means they'll run the ball more and Jones will get more action. Simple as that. Brian Robinson Jr. was saved by a touchdown in an otherwise tough day at the office against the Eagles front 7. He's still the running back 8 overall in standard PPR, and he has 2/3 of the team's rushes at the moment, a very high rate. 4 touchdowns in 4 games also helps, but it definitely isn't a sustainable pace unless he continues to be the all-purpose back Washington has utilized him as. He's got a date with a Bears defense that has allowed at least 25 points in every game of their nearly year-long losing streak, and They allow the second most amount of fantasy points to RBs. Washington is also a 5.5-point favorite. High volume plus a weak opposition. Yeah, I like Brian Robinson Jr. at number 18 here. This Zach Moss situation is about to get weird because in the next couple of weeks, Jonathan Taylor could essentially join in at any time. We're ranking based off of the assumption that Moss is still the lead back, considering that Taylor should be reporting back to practice in the middle of this week, but again, he still doesn't want to play for the Colts. He's made that very clear. The lack of receiving involvement with Moss bit us last week, as he had 18 rushes for 70 yards, but no targets, so his productivity stopped there. Moss faces his toughest test yet. The Titans allow a league-low 2.9 yards per carry, but he does have the benefit of consistently seeing over 75% of snaps until JT is back, of course. Raheem Mostert is not falling off of this list quite yet because I'm not fully ready to throw someone off a cliff for one bad week. Don't kid yourself, Devon Achane has done everything right to make that backfield his. Mostert is still listed as the first option on the Dolphins depth chart, but I'll be watching that very closely throughout this week. Mostert is the RB2 in fantasy overall, and as mentioned with Achane, the Dolphins are heavy favorites this week. They're actually the largest favorites of the week. Their opposition allows 4.4 yards per carry, and at least until Jeff Wilson Jr. is back, I'm not completely forgetting about Raheem Mostert. We've got Ramondre Stevenson here against New Orleans. The idea of Ezekiel Elliott taking on a greater role took a back seat when Dallas blew the doors off of New England last week. That's the third blowout for them this year. Stevenson had 16 touches to Elliott's 8, but wasn't as efficient on the ground. It's not an easy task to face off against the Saints front seven this week, led by Cam Jordan. They hardly allow 4 yards per carry, but I'm still keeping someone averaging 4 targets per game as the lead back on this list. Speaking of usage issues, oh my. Jahmyr Gibbs is giving all of his fantasy owners a ginormous forehead vein of stress. He has only hit the double digits in a standard PPR format on one occasion in 4 tries, and he's seen more than 50% of snaps only once. That was in week 3. He is averaging 3.5 receptions per game and is the more efficient back between himself and Montgomery. That could put the thought in Dan Campbell's head to get his first rounder more involved sooner than later. The other bit of good news is that Detroit is playing one of the 2 remaining winless teams in the league in the Carolina Panthers. Not only do the Panthers allow the third most amount of fantasy points to running backs, but the Lions are 9.5-point favorites. If this one plays out as expected, let's look for Gibbs to get used more. We have Alexander Mattison here at number 23 with some caution. He has looked far more efficient in the last pair of weeks, but Cam Akers just came in and had a higher percentage of snaps than Ty Chandler has had all season, despite being on the team for just a week and a half. 5 rushes for 40 yards is promising, especially considering that Mattison already has had ball security issues with an early season fumble. I wouldn't think much of Cam Akers taking over this job, but it is a disruption that can impact Mattison's usage just slightly going forward. If the Vikings can manage to stay in the game and running the ball here and there is feasible for all 4 quarters, Harris is taking on a Chiefs defensive front, allowing 4.4 yards per carry. That's the 11th highest mark in the league. Miles Sanders comes in at number 24 after looking awful against the Vikings last week. I will not sugarcoat this. Chuba Hubbard didn't look good either, but he had more rushes and was more efficient by about a yard per carry. Hubbard also outdid him in snaps in a relatively close game, which is alarming enough for me to think that Sanders could be a week or 2 from losing the job if this keeps up. After all, Hubbard was on this team last year. The reason I even have Sanders on here in the first place is that he's second among backs in targets with 23 of them. Pass catching involvement is going to be crucial for someone on a team that's winless into October, and I'd project that the Panthers still have a lot of losses ahead. Breece Hall rounds this list out, and while many of you who maybe took him in the first 4 or 5 rounds are getting impatient, things are slowly turning up. In the last 2 weeks, Hall has now been in for over 40% of snaps. He was below that mark in weeks 1 and 2. Again, he's coming back from that knee injury. The Jets are being cautious with him. Delvin Cook is doing Hall a lot of favors, usage-wise, considering he's only averaging 2.5 yards per carry, while Hall is averaging over 6 per carry. Cook's longest run of the season is still at just 10 yards. Hall also has an awesome matchup against the Broncos. They're allowing the most amount of fantasy points to running backs this season. Yes, the numbers will be inflated on that front from the 70-point performance for a bit, but Khalil Herbert ran all over them last week too. I like Hall's odds to put up a double-digit fantasy performance here if, and I mean if, he gets the usage he deserves. Fringe players that just missed this list are Najee Harris, Dameon Pierce, Khalil Herbert, Gus Edwards, Jaylen Warren, and Jaleel McLaughlin. Thank you so much for watching. As always, feel free to leave any questions you may have in the comment section below. Like and subscribe if we're helping you out in fantasy going into week 5, and we will see you in the next video.